door would not open. "There's something wrong with this door," she exclaimed, turning to face the others. "I can't get it open." "What's that?" called Barbara, still waltzing with Raina. "I can't get this door open," Lucia repeated. Barbara and Raina stopped dancing and went across to Lucia at the door. Richard Amory moved to the gramophone to switch it off before joining them. They took it in turns to attempt to get the door open, but without success, observed by Miss Amory, who was awake but still seated, and by Dr. Corelli, who stood by the bookcase. Unnoticed by any of the company, Sir Claud emerged from his study, coffee cup in hand, and stood for a moment or two observing the group clustered around the door to the hall. "What an extraordinary thing!" Rainer exclaimed, abandoning his attempt to open the door, and turning to face the others. "Seems what's stuck somehow." Sir Claude's voice rang across the room, startling them all. "No, it's not stuck." "It's locked." "Locked from the outside." His sister rose and approached Sir Claud. She was about to speak, but he forestalled her. "It was locked by my orders, Caroline," he told her. With all eyes upon him, Sir Claud walked across to the coffee table, took a lump of sugar from the bowl and dropped it into his cup. "I have something to say to you all," he announced to the assembled company. "Richard, would you be so kind as to ring the treadmill?" His son looked as though he were about to make some reply. However, after a pause, he went to the fireplace and pressed a bell in the wall nearby. "I suggest that you all sit down," Sir Claud continued with a gesture towards the chairs. Dr. Coretti, with raised eyebrows, crossed the room to sit on the stool. Edward Raynor and Lucia Amory found chairs for themselves, while Richard Amory chose to stand in front of the fireplace looking puzzled. Caroline Amory and her niece Barbara occupied the settee. When all were comfortably seated, Sir Claud moved the armchair to a position where he could most easily observe all the others. He sat. Door on the left opened, and Treadwell entered. "You rang, Sir Claud?" "Yes, Treadwell." "Did you call the number I gave you?" "Yes, sir." "Was the answer satisfactory?" "Perfectly satisfactory, sir." "And a car has gone to the station?" "Yes, sir." "The car has been ordered to meet the train." "Very well, Treadwell," said Sir Claud. "You may lock up now." "Yes, sir," replied Treadwell as he withdrew. After the butler had closed the door behind him, the sound of a key turning in the lock could be heard. "Claude!" Miss Amory exclaimed. "What on earth does Treadwell think?" "Treadwell is acting on my instructions, Caroline," Sir Claud interacted sharply. Richard Amory addressed his father. "May we ask the meaning of all this?" he inquired coldly. "I am about to explain," replied Sir Claud. "Please listen to me calmly, all of you. To begin with, as you now realize, those two doors," he gestured towards the two doors on the whole side of the library, "are locked on the outside. From my study next door, there is no way out except through this room. The French windows in this room are locked." Swiveling around in his seat to Coretti, he explained, as though in parenthesis, "locked, in fact, by a patent device of my own, which my family knows of, but which they do not know how to immobilize." Again addressing everyone, Sir Claud continued, "This place is a rat trap." He looked at his watch. "It is now 10 minutes to 9. At a few minutes past 9, the rat catcher will arrive." The rat catcher. Richard Amory's face was a study in perplexity. "What rat catcher?" "A detective," explained the famous scientist dryly, as he sipped his coffee. Consternation greeted Sir Claude's announcement. Lucia uttered a low cry, and her husband stared at her intently. Miss Amory gave a shriek. Barbara exclaimed "Crikey!" and Edward Reynard contributed an ineffectual "Oh, I say, Sir Claude." Only Dr. Corelli seemed unaffected. Sir Claude settled in his armchair, holding his coffee cup in his right hand and the saucer in his left. "I seem to have achieved my little effect," he observed with satisfaction. Finishing his coffee, he set the cup and saucer down on the table with a grimace. "The coffee is unusually bitter this evening," he complained. His sister's countenance registered a certain annoyance at the aspersion cast on the coffee, which she took as a direct criticism of her housekeeping. She was about to say something when Richard Amory spoke. "What detective?" he asked his father. "His name is Hercule Poirot," replied Sir Claude. "He is a Belgian." "But why?" Richard persisted. "Why did you send for him?" "A leading question," said his father with an unpleasantly grim smile. "Now we come to the point. For some time past, as most of you know, I have been engaged in atomic research. I have made a discovery of a new explosive. Its force is such that everything hitherto attempted in that line will be mere child's play beside it. Most of this you know already." Corelli got to his feet quickly. "I did not know," exclaimed eagerly. "I am much interested to hear of this." "Indeed, Dr. Corelli." Sir Claude invested the conventionally mean, and Corelli in some embarrassment resumed his seat. "As I was saying," Sir Claude continued, "the force of Amorite, as I call it, is such that where we have hitherto killed by thousands, we can now kill by hundreds of thousands." "How horrible!" exclaimed Lucia with a shudder. "My dear Lucia." Her father-in-law smiled thinly at her as he spoke. "The truth is never horrible, only interesting." "But why," asked Richard, "are you telling us all this?" "Because I have had occasion for some time to believe that a member of this household was attempting to steal the Amorite formula. I had asked Monsieur Poirot to join us tomorrow for the weekend so that he could take the formula back to London with him on Monday and deliver it personally to an official at the Ministry of Defense." "But, Claude, that's absurd. Indeed, it's highly offensive to all of us," Caroline Amory expostulated. "You can't seriously suspect—" "I have not finished, Caroline," her brother interrupted. "And I assure you there is nothing absurd about what I am saying. I repeat, I had invited Hercule Poirot to join us tomorrow, but I have had to change my plans and ask Monsieur Poirot to hurry down here from London this evening. I have taken this step because—" Sir Claude paused. When he resumed speaking, it was more slowly, and with a much more deliberate emphasis. "Because," he repeated, as his glance swept around the assembled company, "the formula, written on an ordinary sheet of notepaper and enclosed in a long envelope, was stolen from the safe in my study some time before dinner this evening. It was stolen by someone in this room." A chorus of shocked exclamations greeted the eminent scientist's announcement. Then everyone began to speak at once. "Stolen formula?" Caroline Amory began. "What? From the safe? Impossible!" Edward Reynard exclaimed. The babble of voices did not include that of Dr. Corelli, who remained seated with a thoughtful expression on his face. The others, however, were silenced only when Sir Claude raised his voice and continued. "I am in the habit of being certain of my facts," he assured his hearers. "At 20 minutes past 7 exactly, I placed the formula in the safe. As I left the study, Reynard here entered it. Blushing either from embarrassment or from anger, the secretary began. Sir Claud, really, I must protest. Sir Claud raised a hand to silence him. Reynard remained in the study, he went on, and was still there working when Dr. Corelli appeared at the door. After greeting him, Reynard left Corelli alone in the study while he went to let Lucia know. I protest. Corelli began, but again Sir Claud raised his hand for silence and continued his narrative. Reynard, however, he said, did not get further than the door of this room, where he met my sister Caroline with Barbara. The three of them remained in this room, and Dr. Corelli joined them. Caroline and Barbara were the only two members of the party who did not enter the study. Barbara glanced at her aunt and then addressed Sir Claud. I'm afraid your information about our movements isn't quite correct, Uncle Claude, she said. I can't be excluded from your list of suspects. Do you remember, Aunt Caroline? You sent me into the study to look for a knitting needle you said you'd mislaid. You wondered if it might be in there. Ignoring his niece's interruption, the scientist continued. Richard came down next. He strolled into the study by himself and remained there for some minutes. My God! Richard exclaimed, barely father, you surely don't suspect that I'd steal your Beckett formula, do you? Looking directly at his son, Sir Claud replied meaningfully, that piece of paper was worth a great deal of money. I see. His son regarded him steadily. And I'm in debt. That's what you mean, isn't it? Sir Claud made no reply to him. His gaze sweeping over the others, he continued. As I was saying, Richard remained in the study for some minutes. He reappeared in this room just as Lucia came in. When dinner was announced a few minutes later, Lucia was no longer with us. I found her in the study, standing by the safe. Father! Exclaimed Richard, moving to his wife and putting an arm protectively about her. I repeat, standing by the safe, Sir Claud insisted. She seemed very much agitated. When I asked what was the matter, she told me she felt unwell. I suggested that a glass of wine might be good for her. She assured me, however, that she was quite all right again, and then left me to join the others. Instead of following Lucia immediately to the dining room, I remained behind in my study. I don't know why, but some instinct urged me to look in the safe. The envelope with the formula in it had disappeared. There was a pause. No one spoke. The immense seriousness of the situation appeared to be dawning on everyone. Then Richard asked, How have you assembled this information about our movements, Father? By taking thought, of course, Sir Claud replied, by observation and deduction. By the evidence of my own eyes, by what I learned from questioning Treadwell. I notice you don't include Treadwell or any of the other servants among your suspects, Claude. Caroline Amory observed tartly, only your family. My family and our guest. Her brother corrected her. That is so, Caroline. I have established to my own satisfaction that neither Treadwell nor any of the domestics were in the study between the time I placed the formula in the safe, the time I opened the safe again to find it missing. He looked at each of them in turn before adding, I hope the position is clear to you all. Whoever took the formula must still have it. Since we returned here from dinner, the dining room has been thoroughly searched. Treadwell would have informed me if the piece of paper had been found hidden there. And as you now realize, I have seen to it that no one has had the opportunity to leave this room. For some moments there was a tense silence, broken only when Dr. Corelli asked politely, Is it your suggestion then, Sir Claud, that we should all be searched? That is not my suggestion, replied Sir Claud, consulting his watch. 'Tis now 9:02. Hercule Poirot would have arrived at Market Preve, where he is being met. At 9 o'clock precisely, Treadwell has orders to switch off the lights from the main switch in the basement. We shall be in complete darkness in this room for 1 minute, and 1 minute only. When the lights go on again, matters will be out of my hands. Hercule Poirot will be here shortly, and he will be in charge of the case. But if, under cover of darkness, the formula is placed here, and Sir Claud slapped his hand down on the table, then I shall inform Monsieur Poirot that I have made a mistake, and that I have no need of his services. That's an outrageous suggestion, Richard declared heatedly. He looked around at the others. I say we should all be searched. I'm certainly willing. So am I, of course, Edward Rayner made haste to announce. Richard Amory looked pointedly at Corelli. The Italian smiled and shrugged his shoulders. And I. Richard's glance moved to his aunt. Oh, pity what, if we must be must, Miss Amory grumbled. Lucia? Richard asked, turning to his wife. No. No, Richard, Lucia replied breathily. Your father's pen is best. Richard looked at her in silence for a moment. Well, Richard, quitted Sir Claud. A heavy sigh was at first his only reply, and then, very well, I agree. He looked at his cousin Barbara, who gave a gesture of assent. Sir Claud leaned back in his chair wearily, when spoke in a slow, dragging voice. The tis red cotters stir in my mirth, he said, and then yawned. The clock on the mantelpiece began to strike. There was complete silence as all turned to listen. Sir Claud turned slowly in his chair, and looked steadily at his son Richard. On the last stroke of 9, the lights suddenly went out, and the room was plunged into darkness. There were a few gasps, and some stifled exclamations from the women, and then Miss Amory's voice rang out clearly. I don't care for this at all. But do be quiet, Aunt Caroline, Barbara ordered her. I'm trying to listen. For a few seconds there was absolute silence, followed by the sounds of heavy breathing, then a rustling of paper. Silence again, before they all heard a kind of metallic clink, the sound of something tearing, and a loud bang, which must surely have been a chair being knocked over. Suddenly Lucia screamed, Sir Claud, I can't bear it. I must have a light. Somebody, please. The room remained in darkness. There was a sharp intake of breath, and then a loud knock at the door leading to the hall. Lucia screamed again. As though in response, the lights suddenly came on again. Richard was now standing by the door, apparently unable to decide whether or not to attempt to open it. Edward Rayner was on his feet by his chair, which had overturned. Lucia lay back in her chair as though about to faint. Sir Claud sat absolutely still in his armchair with his eyes closed. His secretary suddenly pointed to the table beside his employer. Look, he exclaimed, the formula. On the table beside Sir Claud was a long envelope of the type he had earlier described. Ah, thank God, cried Lucia. Thank God. There was another knock at the door, which now opened slowly. Everyone's attention was fixed on the doorway as Treadwell ushered in the stranger, and then withdrew. The assembled company stared at the stranger. What they saw was an extraordinary-looking little man, hardly more than 5 feet 4 inches in height, who carried himself with great dignity. His head was exactly the shape of an egg, and he carried it at a slight angle like an inquiring terrier. His moustache was distinctly stiff and military. He was very neatly dressed. Hercule Poirot, at your service, said the stranger, and bowed. Richard Amory held out a hand. "Monsieur Poirot," he said as they shook hands. "You have too young of horse. You Aisha's son, perhaps?" He moved past Richard into the center of the room. Behind him, another man, tall, middle-aged, and of military bearing, had unobtrusively entered. As he moved to Poirot's side, the detective announced, "My colleague, Captain Hastings." "What a delightful room," Hastings observed as he shook hands with Richard Amory. Richard turned back to Poirot. "I'm sorry, Monsieur Poirot," he said, "but I fear we brought you down here under a misapprehension. The need for your services has passed." "Indeed," replied Poirot. "Yes, I'm sorry," Richard continued. "It's too bad dragging you all the way down here from London. Of course, your fee and expenses, well, they'll be all right, of course." "I comprehend perfectly," said Poirot, "but for the moment it is neither my fee nor my expenses which interest me." "No? Then what does interest me, Mr. Amory? I will tell you. It is just a little point of no consequence, of course, but it was your father who sent for me to come. Why is it not he who tells me to go?" "Oh, of course, I'm sorry," said Richard, turning towards Sir Claud. "Father, would you please tell Monsieur Potter that we no longer have any need of his services?" Sir Claud did not answer. "Father!" Richard exclaimed, moving quickly to Sir Claud's armchair. He bent over his father and then turned around wildly. "Dr. Coretti," he called. Miss Amory rose, white-faced. Coretti swiftly crossed to Sir Claud and felt his pulse. Frowning, he placed his hand over Sir Claud's heart, and then shook his head. Poirot moved slowly to the armchair, a strip looking down at the motionless body of the scientist. "Yes, I feel," he murmured as though to himself. "I very much feel." "How do you feel?" asked Barbara, moving towards him. Poirot looked at her. "I feel that Sir Claud has sent for me too late, mademoiselle." Stunned silence followed after Poirot's statement. Dr. Coretti continued his examination of Sir Claud for a few moments before straightening himself and turning to the others. Addressing Richard Amory, "I am afraid your father is dead," he confirmed. Richard stared at him in disbelief, as though he were unable to take in the Italian doctor's words. Then, "My God! What was it?" "Half Ada?" he asked. "I suppose so," replied Coretti somewhat doubtfully. Barbara moved to her aunt to comfort her, while Miss Amory seemed about to faint. Edward Reynolds joined them, helping to support Miss Amory and whispering to Barbara as he did so, "I suppose that fellow is a real doctor." "Yes, but only an Italian one," Barbara murmured in reply as between them they settled Miss Amory into a chair. Overhearing Barbara's remark, Poirot shook his head energetically. Then, stroking his luxuriant moustache with explicit care, she smiled as he commented softly, "Me? I am a detective, but only a virgin one. Nevertheless, mademoiselle, we foreigners do arrive at the correct answer occasionally." Barbara had the grace to look at least a trifle embarrassed. She and Reno remained in conversation for a few moments, but then Lucia approached Poirot, taking his arm and drawing him aside from the others. "Monsieur Poirot," she urged him breathlessly, "you must stay. You must not let them send you away." Poirot regarded her steadily. His face remained quite impassive as he asked her, "Is it that you wish me to stay, madame?" Yes, replied Lucia, glancing anxiously towards the body of Sir Claud, still seated in its upright position in the armchair. "There's something wrong about all this. My father-in-law's heart was perfectly all right. Perfectly, I tell you. Please, Monsieur Poirot, you must find out what has happened. Dr. Coretti and Richard Amory continued to hover near the body of Sir Claud. Richard, in an agony of indecision, appeared to be almost petrified into immobility. I would suggest, Mr. Amory, Dr. Coretti urged him, but you sent for your father's own physician. I assume he had one. Richard roused himself with an effort. What? Oh yes, he responded. Yes, Dr. Graham, young Kenneth Graham. He has a practice in the village. That he's rather keen on my cousin Barbara. I'm sorry, that's irrelevant, isn't it? Glancing across the room at Barbara, he called for her. What's Kenneth Graham's phone number? Mark it P5, Barbara told him. Richard moved to the phone, lifted the receiver, and asked for the number. While he was waiting to be connected, Edward Raynor, recalling his secretarial duties, asked Richard, "But do you think I should order the car from Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot spread out his hands apologetically. He was about to speak, when Lucia forestalled him. "Monsieur Poirot is remaining at my request," she announced to the company in general. Still holding the telephone receiver to his ear, Richard turned, startled. "What do you mean?" he asked his wife, tersely. Yes, Richard, he must stay," Lucia insisted. Her voice sounded almost hysterical. Miss Amory looked up in consternation. Barbara and Edward Raynor exchanged worried glances. Dr. Corelli stood looking down thoughtfully at the lifeless body of the great scientist, while Hastings, who had been absent-mindedly examining the books on the library shelves, turned to survey the gathering. Richard was about to respond to Lucia's outburst when his attention was claimed by the telephone he was holding. "Oh, what? Is that Dr. Graham?" he asked. It's Richard Amory speaking. My father has had a heart attack. Can you come up at once?" Actually, I'm afraid there's nothing to be done. Yes, he's dead. No. I'm afraid so. Thank you. Replacing the receiver, he crossed the room to his wife and in a low, agitated voice muttered, "Lucia, are you mad? What have you done? Don't you realize we must get rid of this detective?" Astonished, Lucia rose from her chair. "What do you mean?" she asked Richard. Their exchange continued quietly but urgently. "Didn't you hear what father said?" Stone fraught with meaning, he murmured, "The coffee is very bitter." At first Lucia seemed not to understand. "The coffee is very bitter," she repeated. She looked at Richard uncomprehendingly for a moment and then suddenly uttered a cry of horror which she quickly stifled. "You see, Johnson now?" Richard asked. Lowering his voice to a whisper, he added, "He's being poisoned, and obviously by a member of the family. You don't want to grasp this scandal, do you?" "Oh, my God!" murmured Lucia, staring straight in front of her. "Oh, merciful God!" Turning away from her, Richard approached Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot," he began, and then hesitated. "Monsieur?" Poirot queried politely. Summoning up his determination, Richard continued, "Monsieur Poirot, I'm afraid I don't quite understand what it is that my wife has asked you to investigate." Poirot considered for a moment before replying, then, smiling pleasantly, he answered, "Shall we say the theft of a document? That, mademoiselle tells me," he continued, gesturing towards Barbara, "is what I was called down for." Casting a glance of reproach at Barbara, Richard told Poirot, "The document in question has been returned." "Has it?" asked Poirot, his smile becoming rather enigmatic. The little detective suddenly had the attention of everyone present, as he moved to the table in the center of the room and looked at the envelope still lying on it, which had been generally forgotten in the excitement and commotion caused by the discovery of Sir Claud's death. "What do you mean?" Richard Amory asked Hercule Poirot. Poirot gave a flamboyant twist to his moustache, and carefully brushed an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve. Then, "It is, sir, just no doubt, foolish idea of mine," the little detective finally replied. "You see, someone told me the other day a most amusing story. This story of the empty bottle. There was nothing in it." "Sorry, I didn't understand you," Richard Amory declared. Picking up the envelope from the table, Poirot murmured, "I just wondered." He glanced at Richard, who took the envelope from him and looked inside. "It's empty," Richard exclaimed. Screwing up the envelope, he threw it on the table and looked searchingly at Lucia, who moved away from him. Then he continued uncertainly, "I suppose we must be searched. Richard's voice trailed away, and he looked around the room as though seeking guidance. He was met with looks of confusion from Barbara and her aunt, indignation from Edward Rayner, and blandness from Dr. Corelli. Lucia continued to avoid his eye. "Why do you not take my advice, monsieur?" Poirot suggested. "Tell me," he asked, pointing towards the study. "That doorway. Where does he go?" "Oh, that's my father's study in there," Richard told him. Poirot crossed the room to the door, put his head around it to look into the study, and then turned back into the library, nodding as though satisfied. "I see," he murmured. Then, addressing Richard, he added, "Eh bien, monsieur, I see no need why any of you should remain in this room if you would prefer not to." There was a general stir of relief. Dr. Corelli was the first to move. "It is understood, of course," Poirot announced, looking at the Italian doctor, "that no one should leave the house." "I will hold myself responsible for that," Richard declared as Barbara and Rayner left together, followed by Corelli. Caroline Amory lingered by her brother's chair. "Poor dear Claude," she murmured to herself. "Poor dear Claude." Poirot approached her. "You must have courage, mademoiselle," he told her. "This shock to you has been great, I know." Miss Amory looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I'm so glad that I ordered the cook to prepare fried sorrel tonight," she said. "It was one of my brother's favorite dishes." With a brave attempt to look serious and to match the solemnity of her delivery, Poirot answered, Yes, that must be a great comfort to you, I am sure." He shepherded Miss Amory out of the room. Richard followed his aunt out, and after a moment's hesitation Lucia made a brisk exit. Poirot and Hastings were left alone in the room with the body of Sir Claud. As soon as the room was empty, Hastings addressed Poirot eagerly. "Well, what do you think?" he asked. "Shut the door, please, Hastings," was the only reply he received. As his friend complied, Poirot shook his head slowly and looked around the room. He moved about, casting an eye over the furniture and occasionally looking down at the floor. Suddenly he stooped down to examine the overturned chair, a chair in which the secretary Edward Rayner had been sitting when the lights had gone out. From beneath the chair, Poirot picked up a small object. "What have you found?" Hastings asked him. "A key," Poirot replied. "It looks to me as though it might be the key to his safe." "I observed a safe in Sir Claud's study. Will you have the goodness, Hastings, to try this key and tell me if it fits?" Hastings took the key from Poirot and went into the study with it. Meanwhile, Poirot approached the body of the scientist, and feeling in the trouser pocket, removed from it a bunch of keys, each of which he examined closely. Hastings returned, informing Poirot that indeed the key fitted the safe in the study. "I think I can guess what happened," Hastings continued. I imagine Sir Claud must have dropped it, and, he broke off, and Poirot slowly shook his head doubtfully. No, mon ami. Give me the key, please, he requested, frowning to himself as though perplexed. He took the key from Hastings and compared it with one of the keys on the bunch. Then, putting them back in the dead scientist's pocket, he held up the single key. This, he told Hastings, is a duplicate. It is indeed clumsily made, but no doubt it served its purpose. In great excitement, Hastings exclaimed, "Then that means—" He was stopped by a warning gesture from Poirot. The sound of a key being turned in the lock of the door which led to the front hall and the staircase to the upper floors of the house was heard. As the two men turned, it opened slowly, and Treadwell, the butler, stood in the doorway. "I beg your pardon, sir," said Treadwell as he came into the room and shut the door behind him. "Oh, the master told me to lock this door as well as the other one leading from this room until you arrived. The master—" He stopped on seeing the motionless figure of Sir Claud in the chair. "I am afraid your master is dead," Poirot told him. "May I ask your name?" "Treadwell, sir." The servant moved to the front of the desk, looking at the body of his master. "Oh, dear. Poor Sir Claud," he murmured. Turning to Poirot, he added, "Do please forgive me, sir. It's such a shock. May I ask what happened? Is it murder?" "Why should you ask that?" said Poirot. Learning his voice, the butler replied, "There have been strange things happening this evening, sir." "Oh?" exclaimed Poirot as he exchanged glances with Hastings. "Tell me about these strange things." "Well, I hardly know where to begin, sir," Treadwell replied. I think I first felt that something was wrong when the Italian gentleman came to tea." "The Italian gentleman, Dr. Corelli, sir. He came to tea unexpectedly?" asked Poirot. "Yes, sir. And Miss Amory asked him to stay, seeing as how he was a friend of Mrs. Richards, but if you ask me, sir—" He stopped, and Poirot gently prompted him. "Yes?" "I hope you will understand, sir," said Treadwell, "that it is not my custom to gossip about the family, but seeing that the master is dead—" He paused again, and Poirot murmured sympathetically, Yes, I understand. I am sure you were very attached to your master." Treadwell nodded, and Poirot continued, "Sir Claud sent for me in order to tell me something. You must tell me all you can." "Well, then," Treadwell responded, "in my opinion, sir, Mrs. Richard Amory did not want the Italian gentleman asked to dinner. I observed her face when Miss Amory gave the invitation." "What is your own impression of Dr. Corelli?" asked Poirot. "And Dr. Corelli, sir," replied the butler rather haughtily, "is not one of us." Not quite understanding Treadwell's remark, Poirot looked inquiringly at Hastings, who turned away to hide a smile. Trying his colleague a glance of mild reproof, Poirot turned again to Treadwell. The butler's countenance remained perfectly serious. "But did you feel," Poirot queried, "that there was something odd about Dr. Corelli's coming to the house in the way that she did?" "Precisely, sir. It wasn't natural somehow. And it was after he arrived that the trouble began, with the master telling me earlier this evening to send for you and giving orders about the doors being locked. Mrs. Richard, too, hasn't been herself all the evening. She had to leave the dinner table. Mr. Richard, he was very upset about it." "Ah," said Poirot, "she had to leave the table. Did she come into this room?" "Yes, sir," Treadwell replied. Poirot looked around the room. His eye alighted on the handbag which Lucia had left on the table. "One of the ladies has left our bag, I see," he observed as he picked it up. Moving closer to him to look at the handbag, Treadwell told Poirot, "That is Mrs. Richards, sir." "Yes," Hastings confirmed. "I noticed her laying it down there just before she left the room." "Just before she left the room, eh?" said Poirot. "How curious." He put the bag down on the settee, frowned perplexedly, and stood apparently lost in thought. "About locking the door, sir," Treadwell continued after a brief pause, "the master told me—" Suddenly starting out of his reverie, Poirot interrupted the butler. Yes, I must hear all about that now. Let us go through here," he suggested, indicating the door to the front of the house. Treadwell went to the door, followed by Poirot. Hastings, however, declared rather importantly, "Are you think I'll stay here?" Poirot turned and regarded Hastings quizzically. No, please come with us," he requested his colleague. "But don't we get better?" Hastings began when Poirot interrupted him, now speaking solemnly and meaningfully. "I need your cooperation, my friend," he said. "Oh, well, in that case." The three men left the room together, closing the door behind them. No more than a few seconds later, the door leading to the hallway was opened cautiously, and Lucia entered surreptitiously. After a hurried glance around the room as though to assure herself that there was no one there, she approached the round table in the center of the room and picked up Sir Claude's coffee cup. A shrewd, hard look came into her eyes which belied that customary innocent appearance, and she suddenly looked a good deal older. Lucia was still standing with the cup in her hand, as though undecided what to do, when the other door leading to the front of the house opened and Poirot entered the library alone. "Permit me, madame," said Poirot, causing Lucia to start violently. He moved across to her and took the cup from her hand with the air of one indulging in a gesture of simple politeness. I came back for my bag," Lucia gasped. "Ah, yes," said Poirot. "Now let me see, what did I observe a lady's handbag? Ah, yes, over here." He went to the settee, picked up the bag and handed it to Lucia. "Thank you so much," she said, glancing around distractedly as she spoke. "Not at all, madame." After a brief, nervous smile at Poirot, Lucia quickly left the room. When she had gone, Poirot stood quite still for a moment or two, and then picked up the coffee cup. After smelling it cautiously, he took from his pocket a test tube, poured some of the dregs from Sir Claude's cup into it, and sealed the tube. Replacing it in his pocket, he then proceeded to look around the room, counting the cups aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yet 6 coffee cups. A perplexed frown was beginning to gather between Poirot's brows, when suddenly his eyes shone with that green light that always betokened inward excitement. Moving swiftly to the door through which he had recently entered, he opened it and slammed it noisily shut again, and then darted to the French windows, concealing himself behind the curtains. After a few moments, the other door, the one to the hallway, opened, and Lucia entered again, this time even more cautiously than before, appearing to be very much on her guard. Looking about her in an attempt to keep both doors in her sight, she snatched up the coffee cup from which Sir Claude had drunk and surveyed the entire room. Her eye alighted on the small table near the door to the hall, on which there stood a large bowl containing a house-plant. Moving to the table, Lucia thrust the coffee cup upside down into the bowl. Then, still watching the door, she took one of the other coffee cups and placed it near Sir Claude's body. She then moved quickly to the door, but as she reached it, the door opened, and her husband Richard entered with a very tall, sandy-haired man in his early 30s, whose countenance, though amiable, had an air of authority about it. The newcomer was carrying a Blanstone bag. "Lucia," Richard exclaimed, startled. "What are you doing here?" I came to get my handbag," Lucia explained. "Hello, Dr. Graham." "Excuse me, please," she added, hurrying past them. As Richard watched her go, Poirot emerged from behind the curtains, approaching the two men as though he had just entered the room by the other door. "Ah, here it is, Monsieur Poirot. Let me introduce you. Poirot, this is Dr. Graham, Lieutenant Graham." Poirot and the doctor bowed to each other, and Dr. Graham went immediately to the body of the dead scientist to examine it, watched by Richard. Hercule Poirot, to whom they paid no further attention, moved about the room, counting the coffee cups again with a smile. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5, he murmured. 5, indeed. A light of pure enjoyment lit up Poirot's face, and he smiled in his most inscrutable fashion. Taking the test tube out of his pocket, he looked at it, and slowly shook his head. Meanwhile, Dr. Graham had concluded a cursory examination of Sir Claud Amory's body. "I'm afraid," he said to Richard, "that I shan't be able to sign a death certificate. Sir Claud was in a perfectly healthy condition. It seems extremely unlikely to me that he could have suffered a sudden heart attack. I fear we shall have to find out what he had eaten or drunk in his last hours." "Good heavens, man, is that really necessary?" asked Richard with a note of alarm in his voice. "He hadn't eaten or drunk anything that the rest of us, and it's absurd to suggest—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Dr. Graham interrupted, speaking firmly and with authority. "I'm telling you that there will have to be an inquest by law, though the coroner will certainly want to know the cause of death. At present, I simply do not know what caused Sir Claud's death. I'll have his body removed, and I'll arrange for an autopsy to be done first thing tomorrow morning as a matter of urgency. I shall be able to get back to you later tomorrow with some hard facts." He left the room swiftly, followed by a still expostulating Richard. Poirot looked after them, and then assumed a puzzled expression as he turned to look again at the body of the man who had called him away from London with such urgency in his voice. "What was it you wanted to tell me, my friend? I wonder. What did you fear? Was it simply the theft of your formula, or did you fear for your life as well? You relied on Hercule Poirot for help. You called for help too late. But I shall try to discover the truth." Shaking his head thoughtfully, Poirot was about to leave the room when Treadwell entered. "I've shown the other gentleman to his room, sir," he told Poirot. "May I take you to yours, which is the adjoining one at the top of the stairs? I've also taken the liberty of providing a little cold supper for you both after your journey. On the way upstairs, I'll show you where the dining room is." Poirot inclined his head in polite acceptance. "Thank you very much, Treadwell," he said. "Incidentally, I am going to advise Mr. Amory most strongly that this room should be kept locked until tomorrow, when we should have further information about this evening's distressing occurrence. Oh, would you be so kind as to make it secure, or do we leave it now?" "Most certainly, sir, if that is your wish," replied Treadwell, as Poirot preceded him out of the library. When Hastings came down to breakfast late the following morning, after having slept long and well, he found himself eating alone. From Treadwell he learned that Edward Rayner had breakfasted much earlier and had gone back to his room to put some of Sir Claud's papers in order, that Mr. and Mrs. Amory had had breakfast in their suite of rooms and had not yet appeared, and that Barbara Amory had taken a cup of coffee out into the garden where she was presumably still sunning herself. Miss Caroline Amory had ordered breakfast in her room, pleading a slight headache, and Treadwell had not seen her subsequently. "Have you caught sight of Monsieur Poirot tall this morning, Treadwell?" Hastings asked, and was told that his friend had risen early and had decided to take a walk to the village. "I understood Monsieur Poirot to say that he had some business to conduct there," Treadwell added. After finishing a lavish breakfast of bacon, sausage and eggs, toast and coffee, Hastings returned to his comfortable room on the first floor, which offered a splendid view of part of the garden and, for a few minutes, which Hastings found rewarding, of the sunbathing Barbara Amory as well. It was not until Barbara had come indoors that Hastings settled down in an armchair with that morning's Times, which had of course gone to press too early to contain any mention of Sir Claud Amory's death the previous evening. Hastings turned to the editorial page and began to read. A good half-hour later he awakened from a light slumber to find Hercule Poirot standing over him. "I'm sure you are hard at work on the case, I see," Poirot chuckled. "As a matter of fact, Poirot, I was thinking about last night's event for quite some time," Hastings asserted. I must have dozed off." "And why not, my friend?" Poirot assured him. "Me? I have been thinking about the death of Sir Claud as well, and of course the theft of his so important formula. I have, in fact, already taken some action, and I am expecting at any minute a telephone message to tell me if a certain suspicion of mine is correct or not." "What or whom do you suspect, Poirot?" Hastings asked eagerly. Poirot looked out of the window before replying. "No, I do not think I can reveal that to you at this stage of the game, my friend," he replied mischievously. "Let us say that, as the magicians on the stage like to assure us, the quickness of the hand deceives the eye." "Really, Poirot," Hastings exclaimed, "you can be extremely irritating at times. I do think you ought to at least let me know whom you suspect of having stolen the formula. After all, I might be able to help you, but—" Poirot stopped his colleague with an airy gesture of his hand. The little detective was now wearing his most innocent expression and gazing out of the window meditatively into the far distance. "You have puzzled, Hastings," he asked. "You are wondering to yourself why I do not launch myself in pursuit of a suspect. Well, so something of a kind. It is no doubt what you would do if you were in my place," observed Poirot complacently. "I understand that. But I am not of those who enjoy rushing about seeking a needle in a haystack, as you English say. For the moment I am content to wait, as to why I wait. It be to the intelligence of Hercule Poirot. Things are sometimes perfectly clear, which are not at all clear to those who are not so greatly gifted." "But, no, Poirot," Hastings exclaimed. "Juno, I'd give a considerable sum of money to see you make a thorough ass of yourself, just for once. You're so compoundedly conceited." "Do not outrage yourself, my dear Hastings," Poirot replied soothingly. "In verity, I observe that there are times when you seem almost to detest me. Alas, I suffer the penalties of quietness." The little man puffed out his chest and sighed so comically that Hastings was forced to laugh. "Poirot, you really had the best opinion of yourself of anyone I've ever known," he declared. "What will you? When one is a unique one, does it? But now to serious matters, my dear Hastings. Let me tell you that I have asked Sir Claud's son, Mr. Richard Amory, to meet us in the library at noon. I say ask, Hastings, for I need you to be there, my friend, to observe closely." "As always, I shall be delighted to assist you, Poirot," his friend assured him. At noon, Poirot, Hastings, and Richard Amory met in the library, from which the body of Sir Claud had been removed late the previous evening. While Hastings listened and observed from a comfortable position on the settee, the detective asked Richard Amory to recount in detail the events of the evening prior to his Poirot's arrival. When he had concluded his recital of events, Richard, sitting in the chair which his father had occupied the previous evening, added, "Well, that's about everything, I think. I hope I've made myself bare." "That perfectly, Monsieur Amory, perfectly," Poirot replied, leaning against an arm of the only armchair in the room. "I now have a clear tableau." Shutting his eyes, he attempted to conjure up the scene. There is Sir Claud in his chair, dominating the situation. Then the darkness. The knocking on the door. Yes, indeed, a dramatic little scene. "Well," said Richard, making as if to rise, "if that's all, just one little minute," said Poirot, with a gesture as though to detain him. Lowering himself to his chair again with an air of reluctance, Richard asked, "Yes?" "What about earlier in the evening, Monsieur Amory?" "Earlier in the evening?" "Yes," Poirot reminded him. "After dinner." "Oh, that," said Richard. "Oh, there's really nothing more to tell. My father and his secretary Edward Rayner, went straight into my father's study. The rest of us were in here." Poirot beamed at Richard encouragingly. "Had your tea?" "What?" "Oh, we just talked. We had the gramophone on for most of the time." Poirot thought for a moment, then, "Nothing took place that strikes you as worth recording?" he asked. "Nothing whatever," Richard affirmed very quickly. Watching him closely, Poirot pressed on. "When was the coffee served?" "Immediately after dinner," was Richard's reply. Poirot made a circular motion with his hand. "Did the butler hand it around, or did he leave it here to be brought out?" "I really can't remember," said Richard. Poirot gave a slight sigh. He thought for a moment and then asked, "Did you all take coffee?" "Yes, I think so." "All except Rayner, that is. He doesn't bring coffee." "And Sir Claud's coffee was taken to him in the study?" "I suppose so," replied Richard with some irritation beginning to show in his voice. "Are all these details really necessary?" Poirot lifted his arms in a gesture of apology. "I am so sorry," he said. "It is just that I am very anxious to get the whole picture straight in my mind's eye. And after all, we do want to get this precious formula back, do we not?" "I suppose so," was again Richard's rather sullen rejoinder, at which Poirot's eyebrows shot up exaggeratedly, and he uttered an exclamation of surprise. No, of course we do," Richard hastened to add. Poirot, looking away from Richard Amory, asked, "Now, when did Sir Claud come from the study into this room?" "Oh, just as they were trying to get that door open," Amory told him. "They? Quitted Poirot, rounding on him. "Yes, Rayner and the others." "May I ask who wanted it opened?" "My wife, Lucia," said Richard. "She hadn't been feeling very well all the evening." Poirot's tone was sympathetic as he replied, "La poor Fred dame. I hope she finds herself better this morning. Then, one or two things I urgently desire to ask her." "Oh, I'm afraid that's quite impossible," said Richard. "She's not up to seeing anyone or answering any questions. In any case, there's nothing she could tell you that I couldn't." Quite so," Poirot assured him. "But to women, Monsieur Amory have a great capacity for observing things in detail. Still, doubtless your aunt, Miss Amory, will do as well." "She's in bed," said Richard hastily. "My father's death was a great shock to her." "Yes, I see," murmured Poirot thoughtfully. And there was a pause. Richard, looking distinctly uncomfortable, rose and turned to the French windows. "Let's have some air," he announced. "It's very hot in here." "Ah, you are like all the English," Poirot declared, smiling. "The good open air. You will not leave it in the open. No, must be put inside the house." "Well, you don't mind, I hope?" Richard asked. "Me?" said Poirot. "No, of course not. I have adopted all the English habits. Everywhere I am taken for an Englishman." On the settee, Hastings could not help but smile to himself. "But pardon me, Monsieur Amory, is not that window locked by some ingenious device?" "Yes, 'tis," replied Richard, "but the key to it's on my father's bunch of keys, which I have here." Taking a bunch of keys from his pocket, he moved to the French windows and undid the catch, bringing the windows open wide. Moving away from him, Poirot sat on the stool well away from the French windows and the fresh air, and shivered, while Richard took a deep breath of air and then stood for a moment, looking out at the garden before coming back to Poirot with the air of someone who has arrived at a decision. "Monsieur Poirot," Richard Amory declared, "I won't beat about the bush. I know my wife begged you last night to remain, but she was upset and hysterical and hardly knew what she was doing. I'm the person concerned, and I tell you frankly that I don't care a damn about the formula. My father was a rich man. This discovery of his was worth a great deal of money, but I don't need more than I've got, and I can't pretend to share his enthusiasm in the matter. There are explosives enough in the world already." "Nessie," murmured Poirot thoughtfully. "What I say," continued Richard, "is that we should let the whole thing drop." Poirot's eyebrows shot up as he made his familiar gesture of surprise. "You prefer that I should keep out?" he asked. "That I should make no further investigations?" "Well, yes, that's it." Richard Amory sounded uncomfortable as he half turned away from Poirot. "But," the detective persisted, "whoever stole the formula would not do so in order to make no use of it." "No," Richard admitted. He turned back to Poirot, but still. Slowly and meaningfully, Poirot continued. "And then you do not object to the, how shall I put it, the stigma?" "Stigma?" exclaimed Richard sharply. 5 people, Poirot explained to him. 5 people had the opportunity of stealing the formula. Until one is proved guilty, the other 4 cannot be proved innocent. Treadwell had entered the room while Poirot was speaking. As Richard began to stammer irresolutely, the butler interrupted him. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said to his employer, "but Dr. Graham is here and would like to see you." Clearly glad of the opportunity to escape further questioning from Poirot, Richard replied, "Well, I'll come at once," moving to the door as he spoke. Turning to Poirot, he asked formally, "Would you excuse me, please?" as he left with Treadwell. When the 2 men had departed, Hastings rose from the settee and approached Poirot, bursting with suppressed excitement. "I say," he exclaimed, "poison, eh?" "What, my dear Hastings?" asked Poirot. "Poison, surely," Hastings repeated, nodding his head vigorously. Poirot surveyed his friend with an amused twinkle in his eye. "How dramatic you are, my dear Hastings," he exclaimed. "With what swiftness and brilliance you leap to conclusions." "Now then, Poirot," Hastings protested, "you can't put me off that way. You're not going to pretend that you think the old fellow died of heart disease. What happened last night positively leaps to the eye. But I must say Richard Amory can't be a very bright sort of chap. I mean, the possibility of poison doesn't seem to have occurred to him." "You think not, my friend?" asked Poirot. "I spotted it last night when Dr. Graham announced that he couldn't issue a death certificate and said that there'd have to be an autopsy." Poirot gave a slight sigh. Yes, he murmured placatingly. "It is the result of the autopsy that Dr. Graham comes to announce this morning. We shall know whether you are right or not in a very few minutes." Poirot seemed to be about to say something further, but then checked himself. He moved to the mantelpiece and began to adjust the vase containing. Hastings watched him affectionately. "I'd say, Poirot," he laughed, "what a fellow you are for neatness." "Is not the effect more pleasing now?" asked Poirot as he surveyed the mantelpiece with his head on one side. Hastings snorted. "Can't say it wired me greatly before." "Beware," said Poirot, shaking an admonishing finger at him. "This cemetery, it is everything. Everywhere there should be neatness and order, especially in the little guy's cells of the brain." He tapped his head as he spoke. "Oh, come on, don't leap onto your hobby horse," Hastings begged him. "Just tell me what your precious little grey cells make of this business." Poirot moved to the settee and sat before replying. He regarded Hastings steadily, his eyes narrowing like a cat's until they showed only a gleam of green. "If you would use your grey cells and attempt to see the whole case clearly as I attempt to do, you would perhaps perceive the truth, my friend," he announced smartly. "However," he continued in a tone which suggested that he considered he was behaving with great magnanimity, "before Dr. Graham arrives, let us first hear the ideas of my friend Hastings." "Well," Hastings began eagerly, "the key being found under the secretary's chair is suspicious." "You think so, do you, Hastings?" "Of course," his friend replied, "highly suspicious. But on the whole I plump the Italian." "Ah," Potter murmured, "the mysterious Dr. Caffretti." "Mysterious, exactly," Hastings continued. "That's precisely the right word for him. What's he doing down here in the country? Well, I'll tell you. He was artist at Claud Amory's formula. He's almost certainly the emissary of a foreign government. You know the kind of thing I mean." "I do indeed, Hastings," Potter responded with a smile. "After all, I do